Ancient Sumerian tablets record the final warning left by the Anunnaki before they departed Earth. The message, preserved in clay and sealed within temple archives for thousands of years, describes a divine council's decision to withdraw from human civilization, a calculated evacuation that left cities intact but ritually abandoned, their sanctuaries empty, their priests calling to silent skies. This is the narrative that has circulated through alternative history channels, documentary series, and best-selling books for nearly half a century. The story is compelling. Advanced beings once governed humanity directly, then left abruptly, leaving behind cryptic warnings about environmental collapse, cosmic cycles, and the fragility of civilized order. But when we return to the tablets themselves, to the actual cuneiform impressions pressed into wet clay 5,000 years ago, something more complex begins to emerge. The clay is real. The archives exist. 500,000 tablets rest in climate-controlled museum basements from London to Baghdad to Philadelphia. The Anunnaki appear in these texts not as speculation, but as documented entities within a theological administrative system so detailed it recorded daily bread offerings, ritual schedules, and the exact procedures for divine council meetings. What the tablets describe, however, is not what modern interpreters often claim they describe. The distance between the ancient record and the contemporary narrative is vast, measured not just in millennia, but in translation choices, fragmentary evidence, and the human tendency to fill interpretive voids with familiar patterns. The journey from what Sumerian priests actually wrote to what we now believe they meant reveals as much about our own era as it does about theirs. This is an investigation into that distance, into the records themselves, the gods they describe, the warnings they preserve, and the extraordinary mutation of meaning that occurred when 20th century readers encountered Bronze Age theology through the lens of space-age anxiety. The tablets wait in their archives. The mystery is not whether they contain a message. The mystery is whether we have been reading it correctly. The recovery of ancient Mesopotamia began with silence. For nearly 2,000 years, the cities of Sumer existed only as mounds of earth scattered across the Iraqi desert. Tells, the Arabic term for hills, that were not geological formations, but the compressed remains of human habitation. Beneath the sand and silt lay Ur, Nippur, Eridu, Lagash. The names had survived in fragmented classical references and biblical genealogies, but the civilizations themselves had vanished so completely that their written language was forgotten, their gods reduced to footnotes in Greek histories, their administrative systems lost. Then, in the 19th century, excavators began pulling clay from the ground. What they found was not stone monuments or golden apple treasures, but something more durable. Tablets, hundreds of thousands of them. Small rectangular blocks of clay, some no larger than a credit card, others the size of a notebook, all covered in wedge-shaped impressions that had been pressed into the surface while the clay was still wet, then baked hard by the sun or by the fires that destroyed the buildings housing them. These were not decorative artifacts. They were documents, contracts, temple inventories, astronomical observations, medical prescriptions, letters between merchants, royal inscriptions, mythological narratives, and buried within the mythological texts, repeated across multiple tablets from different cities and different centuries, a name that would eventually migrate from academic obscurity to global fascination: Anunnaki. The British Museum now holds tablet K3473, part of the Atrahasis epic, recovered from the ruins of Nineveh in what is now northern Iraq. The University of Pennsylvania Museum houses tablets from Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, where the Temple of Enlil, chief executive of the divine hierarchy, once dominated the landscape. The Louvre preserves fragments from Girsu. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad contains materials excavated from Babylon itself. These tablets do not agree on every detail. They were written across a span of 3,000 years, in languages that evolved from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian. They were copied, recopied, adapted, and localized by scribes working in different cities with different political priorities. Some tablets are complete, most are fragments, shattered pieces that scholars spend decades trying to match with other fragments held in museums on different continents. But within this fragmented, contradictory, geographically scattered archive, patterns emerge. Administrative patterns, theological patterns, and, most critically for our investigation, patterns of crisis, response, and withdrawal. The word Anunnaki does not appear in isolation. It appears in lists, in genealogies, in descriptions of divine councils convened to make binding decisions about the fate of humanity. It appears in flood narratives, in creation accounts, in temple dedication rituals, where kings describe obtaining approval from the Anunnaki before constructing sacred buildings. The term itself breaks into components that Sumerian linguists have debated for over a century. On the sky or the god Anu who personified it. Nun, prince or noble. Ki, earth. At its most literal level, the word suggests princely offspring related to earth, or those of princely seed who descended. But even this basic etymology is contested. The tablets that preserve the term come from different periods. Early dynastic inscriptions from around 2500 BC use a shorter form, Anuna. By the time we reach Old Babylonian texts from 1800 BCE, the term has evolved into Anunnaki, often paired with another group of deities called the Igigi. In Neo-Assyrian texts from the first millennium BCE, the Anunnaki have shifted function entirely. They are no longer sky gods or divine counselors, but judges of the underworld, residents of the realm of the dead. This evolution matters because it demonstrates that the Anunnaki were not a fixed concept. They were a category that shifted as Mesopotamian civilization itself transformed from scattered city-states into imperial bureaucracies, from Sumerian-speaking agricultural communities into Akkadian-speaking military powers, from independent temple economies into centralized royal administrations. The tablets that describe them were not written as mythology in the sense we understand the term today. They were administrative documents, ritual manuals, offering schedules, legal precedents. The Sumerian scribes who recorded these texts were professionals trained in specialized schools attached to temples. They were accountants, archivists, liturgists. When they wrote that the Anunnaki decreed the fates of humanity, they were not composing creative fiction. They were documenting what they believed to be the operational structure of reality. And what they documented consistently was a system under strain. The tablets record councils convened to address crises. They describe divine frustration with populations that had grown beyond manageable levels. They preserve warnings delivered through omens, celestial phenomena that priests tracked and correlated with political outcomes. They catalog interventions, droughts imposed to reduce populations, famines engineered through divine decree, plagues released as calculated control measures. And when these interventions failed, when the population continued to rebound and the systemic disorder continued to intensify, the tablets describe a final solution, not punishment, not moral judgment in the way later religious traditions would frame divine wrath. The language is colder, more procedural. The gods convene, they deliberate, they reach consensus. They authorize the flood, and then critically, they evacuate. This is where the contemporary narrative about the Anunnaki's final warning finds its foothold. Because the tablets do describe departure. They describe temples emptied of sacred objects. They describe gods who once governed directly becoming distant, silent, unreachable. They describe a transformation from presence to absence, from interaction to faith, from administration to prayer. But the tablets do not describe why this withdrawal occurred in the terms modern interpreters have assigned to it. They do not mention planetary orbits, bringing the gods home. They do not reference atmospheric repair or gold mining operations or technological infrastructure failing on a distant world. These elements entered the narrative much later, through a series of translation choices and interpretive leaps that we will trace in detail as this investigation proceeds. For now, the essential point is this: the clay tablets exist. They are real, physical objects holding real, translatable text. And they do describe entities called the Anunnaki, who governed, intervened, withdrew, and left behind records that priests maintained for centuries, even after the direct presence had ceased. The question is not whether the tablets record something significant. The question is what precisely they record, and how a Bronze Age theological administrative system describing irrigation crises and divine labor disputes became, in the space of a few decades, a global narrative about ancient astronauts and suppressed extraterrestrial warnings. The mutation of that meaning is the story we are following, and it begins not with modern reinterpretation, but with the original function these deities served in the oldest cities humanity ever built. The inscriptions of Gudea, ruler of Lagash, around 2144 BCE, describe a dream. In the dream, a figure appears to the king, a man of enormous stature, whose head reaches the heavens, whose wings stretch across the horizon, whose lower body ends in a flood of water. The king does not recognize this figure. He consults priests, and they identify the entity as Ningirsu, the patron god of Lagash, whose temple has fallen into disrepair. Ningirsu delivers instructions: rebuild the temple. Specific architectural plans follow: measurements, materials, the proper orientation of walls and gates. Gudea obeys. He quarries stone, imports cedar from distant mountains, gathers precious metals. He buries foundation deposits beneath the temple corners, small bronze figurines showing the king himself carrying a basket of mud for bricks, performing the labor of construction. The inscriptions record that when the work is complete, Ningirsu takes up residence in the temple. Offerings are made, rituals are performed. The god, the text states, is present. This pattern, direct communication, specific instruction, physical labor in response, divine presence as reward, appears throughout early dynastic and three-period texts. It is not unique to Gudea or to Lagash. Kings across Sumer describe receiving divine mandates to build or rebuild temples. They describe the gods as residents of these structures, requiring daily sustenance, wearing clothes that priests change according to seasonal schedules, sleeping in beds that are ritually prepared each night. The Anunnaki appear in this system not as a single entity, but as a class designation. Temple offering lists from catalog deliveries to the 7 Anunnaki, or the Anunnaki of Eridu. Royal hymns describe kings receiving approval from the Great Anunnaki before undertaking major building projects. Legal texts reference judgments rendered before the Anunnaki, suggesting they functioned as divine witnesses or arbiters in formal proceedings. But the texts also preserve a hierarchy within this category. At the apex sat Anu, the sky god, whose name was simply the Sumerian word for heaven. He ruled from a Tesadi, celestial realm, and rarely descended to earth, preferring to delegate authority to subordinate administrators. Below him operated Enlil, whose name translates as Lord Wind or Lord Command, the chief executive managing terrestrial affairs, the stern enforcer of divine decrees. Alongside Enlil worked Enki, called Ea in later Babylonian sources, god of wisdom and subterranean fresh water, the problem solver who operated through knowledge rather than force. And Ninhursag, the birth goddess, the specialist in biological creation whose precise functions the tablets describe with clinical detail. These 4 comprised what texts call the great gods. But they did not work alone. Below them served 2 distinct categories of divine beings, and the relationship between these categories drives much of the narrative tension preserved in the mythological texts. The Anunnaki proper were the decision-makers, the council members, the deities who decreed the fates in formal assembly. The Igigi were the workers, the divine underclass who performed the exhausting tasks that maintained cosmic infrastructure. This distinction appears most clearly in the Atrahasis epic, a text whose oldest fragments date to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE. The epic opens with a phrase that translators have struggled to render precisely: Inuma ilu awilum. Word for word, it reads something like, "When gods were man," or "When the gods were like humans." The implication is temporal. There was a time when even gods performed manual labor. The text describes this labor in specific terms. The Igigi dug the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They excavated irrigation canals. They cleared silt from channels. They hauled earth. The work was crushing. The duration is given as 40 years, though whether this represents literal time or a symbolic figure for too long remains debated. What is not debated is that the text describes this labor as unbearable, excessive, a burden that eventually broke the workers' willingness to continue. So they rebelled. Not through violence or cosmic battle, but through labor action. They burned their tools. They marched to Nippur. They surrounded the temple of Enlil in the middle of the night, carrying torches, making their presence impossible to ignore. Enlil's response reveals something critical about the power dynamics the text assumes. He does not simply command obedience. He does not destroy the rebels through divine force. He is frightened. The text states this explicitly. He calls an emergency meeting of the Divine Council. He summons Anu and Enki, and he asks a question that suggests genuine uncertainty about how to proceed. Who is the instigator of this war? The Igigi answer collectively. Every single one of us gods has declared war. The work is too hard. The distress is too much. This is where Enki proposes the solution that will, according to the mythology, result in human existence. The logic is purely instrumental. The gods need workers. The Igigi have refused to work. Destroying the workforce solves nothing. The labor still requires performance. Therefore, create a new category of worker. Beings intelligent enough to understand complex agricultural tasks, physically capable of sustained labor, able to reproduce to maintain population levels, but crucially, subordinate. Lacking whatever quality allowed the Igigi to organize collective resistance. Enki turns to Ninhursag. The text refers to her by another name here, Mami, or sometimes Nintu, the birth goddess, the womb goddess. Enki describes the specifications. Ninhursag clarifies jurisdiction. It is not possible for me to make things. Skills belong to Enki. This is not refusal. This is administrative protocol. Creation requires collaboration between the designer and the one who can execute biological implementation. What follows is described with procedural precision. A god is slaughtered. The text names him We'ila, specifying that he possessed Temu, often translated as rationality or personality. His blood is mixed with clay taken from the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater realm Enki governs. Ninhursag needs the mixture. She shapes it into 14 pieces, 7 male, 7 female. She summons birth goddesses to assist. She recites incantations specifying form and function. The text gives a gestation period, 9 months. Then the first humans emerge. The term used is Lulu, sometimes translated as primitive worker, sometimes as mixed being. Mixed because they contain both earthly material and divine essence. Workers because that is their designated purpose. The tablet records immediate deployment. The new beings are distributed to fields and canals. They begin carrying baskets. They begin maintaining irrigation systems. The Igigi are relieved of their burden. The divine administration resumes normal operations. This is not a creation story in the transcendent sense. This is engineering documentation. And what it documents is the establishment of a system that will, within a relatively short time frame measured in the text's own chronology, produce the exact crisis it was designed to prevent, because the created workers reproduce. and they reproduce faster than the gods calculated. Each generation is larger than the last. The text does not specify the mechanism, whether this was a design flaw or an unforeseen emergent property, but it records the outcome with administrative clarity. Within 1,200 years, the tablets state, humanity had multiplied to levels the gods found overwhelming. The term the text uses for this condition is rigmu. Standard translations render it as noise. But linguistic analysis of the word's deployment across Mesopotamian literature reveals it appears most frequently in contexts describing not acoustic volume, but administrative disorder. Legal disputes, market chaos, border conflicts, situations where governance has broken down and predictable systems have become unmanageable. When the Atrahasis epic states that Enlil could not sleep because of the rigmu, it is not describing mere loudness, it is describing systemic breakdown. Population levels exceeding infrastructure capacity, resource distribution networks failing under strain. The careful hierarchical order that the divine bureaucracy maintained beginning to fracture under the weight of demographic pressure it had not anticipated and could not administratively control. Enlil's solution follows the same pattern as the original labor crisis. Calibrated intervention designed to restore system equilibrium. First, drought. The text describes this not as wrathful punishment, but as resource reduction. Cut rainfall to force population contraction. The measure fails. Humanity adapts, expands irrigation, develops storage systems. The population declines temporarily, then rebounds. Second, famine. More severe than drought. The text describes 6 years of scarcity. Conditions so extreme that people resort to cannibalism. Still, the population recovers. Humans prove more resilient than the gods calculated. Third, plague. The text uses the term namta, disease sent deliberately, not natural epidemic, but engineered pathogen. The description is clinical. Let the disease break out like a storm. The death toll is substantial, but again, temporary. Within generations, population metrics return to previous unsustainable levels. The pattern the tablets preserve is not divine cruelty. It is divine failure. Each intervention more severe than the last, each producing only temporary correction before the system returns to its previous trajectory. The gods, these tablets reveal, were not omnipotent. They were administrators discovering their administrative tools no longer functioned. And this is when Enlil calls the council meeting that will result in the flood, the event that later traditions will interpret as moral judgment, but which the text itself frames as terminal. Intervention, not punishment for human wickedness. Elimination of a workforce that had become unmanageable, regardless of whether unmanageability constituted moral failure. The decision, as the tablet records it, is authorization for total reset. Destroy the population. Return the earth to pre-human conditions. The Igigi will not return to labor. That option is foreclosed. But Enlil's argument carries weight nonetheless. Better no workforce than one that destabilizes the entire system. This is the context in which the warning emerges. Not as prophecy delivered to modern humanity, but as the last communication within a theological framework where gods governed through procedure, where crises were managed through calculated intervention, and where the failure of all previous measures forced a decision that would, according to the mythology, require even the gods themselves to evacuate. What the tablets describe next is fear. Not human fear of divine judgment, but divine fear of forces they themselves had set in motion and could no longer control. The tablet fragment designated K3473 plus K3512, housed in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection, preserves a section of the Atrahasis flood narrative that contains a detail most summaries omit. After Enlil authorizes the deluge, after the storm, God, Adad is commanded to release the rains, and the underworld gods are ordered to break open the subterranean springs. The text describes the Anunnaki's reaction to their own decree. They were terrified. The specific phrasing varies slightly across the tablet's damaged sections, but the essential meaning remains clear. The gods were frightened by the deluge. They went up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs, crouched outside. This is not the behavior of omnipotent beings calmly observing judgment's execution. This is evacuation under duress. The gods flee to the highest heaven, the domain of Anu, removed from the terrestrial zone where the catastrophe will unfold. And even there, the text states, they huddle. They cower. They retreat to the outer walls, as far from the rising waters as they can position themselves. Then comes another detail that disrupts traditional theological assumptions. The gods were in need of food. For 7 days and 7 nights, the text continues, the flood waters rise. During this period, no offerings can be made. The temples are submerged. The priests are drowned. The daily bread deliveries, the beer libations, the ritual meals that constituted the economic relationship between humans and gods, all of this ceases, and the gods, according to the tablets, begin to starve. This changes the interpretive frame entirely. If the gods require sustenance, if their existence depends on offerings that only humans provide, then the relationship is not simply one of masters and servants. It is symbiotic, interdependent. The created workforce has become essential to the survival of the creators. When the flood finally recedes, and Atrahasis emerges from his sealed vessel, having survived by following Enki's clandestine warning delivered to a wall rather than directly to the human, thus technically avoiding defiance of the council's decree. The first thing he does, build an altar and prepare an offering. The tablet describes what happens with devastating clarity. The gods smelled the savor. The gods gathered like flies over the sacrifice. Like flies. Not as dignified recipients of worship, not as transcendent beings graciously accepting tribute, like starving creatures swarming toward the first available food source after prolonged deprivation. This is the moment when the structural contradiction at the heart of the system becomes unavoidable. The gods created humanity to relieve themselves of labor, but in doing so, they created their own dependency. They eliminated the Igigi workforce, replacing it with biological entities that reproduced beyond control. Then, when those entities became ungovernable, the gods attempted elimination, only to discover that elimination meant their own starvation. Enlil's rage when he sees survivors is not moral outrage at disobedience. It is administrative fury at a plan that failed. He turns on Enki, demanding to know who circumvented the council's decree. Enki's response is preserved verbatim across multiple tablet fragments, and it is not an apology, it is a structural argument. How could you, unthinking, bring on a flood? Punish the wrongdoer for his wrongdoing, punish the transgressor for his transgression, but do not cut off entirely, or things will collapse. The logic is economic, not ethical. Total elimination is administratively unsound. The system requires human labor. The gods cannot sustain themselves without the offerings that labor produces. Therefore, survival of at least a remnant population is not mercy. It is systemic necessity. The compromise reached is recorded in subsequent tablet sections. Humanity will, be allowed to continue, but controls will be implemented. Birth goddesses will cause some women to be infertile. Demons will claim some infants before they reach maturity. Disease will maintain population pressure at levels the gods believe they can manage. The new arrangement, the text implies, will prevent another crisis of overpopulation while preserving enough human presence to maintain the offering schedules. But the compromise reveals something the gods cannot acknowledge within the mythology's own framework. They have lost control. The hierarchical system where Anunnaki decree and humans obey has fractured. The flood was supposed to be a demonstration of ultimate authority. Instead, it demonstrated ultimate vulnerability. The gods went hungry. They cowered. They compromised, not from benevolence, but from need. And this is where the archaeological record begins to align with the textual account in ways that complicate simple dismissal of the flood narrative as pure mythology. Excavations at Ur, conducted by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, uncovered a layer of water-laid silt, 8 feet thick, separating the earlier Al-Ubaid period remains from later Proto-Literate materials. Woolley initially proclaimed this the physical evidence of the biblical deluge. Subsequent analysis showed the silt layer dated to approximately 3,500 BCE, far too early to align with Sumerian chronology for a unified flood event. Moreover, similar excavations at nearby Kish revealed a different silt layer from a different time period, approximately 2,900 to 2,600 BCE. What the stratigraphy actually demonstrates is not a single global catastrophe, but multiple localized flooding events severe enough to destroy cities and deposit meters of sediment across inhabited areas. The Tigris-Euphrates Delta was, from a hydrological perspective, extraordinarily vulnerable. The rivers changed course. Levees failed. Spring snowmelt from distant mountains could arrive as catastrophic surges that no amount of canal engineering could contain. The tablets do not record prophecy. They record traumatic memory. Real floods that wiped out real cities, filtered through theological frameworks that interpreted environmental disaster as divine decree. The warning was not about future catastrophe. It was about past catastrophe memorialized as religious instruction. Maintain the infrastructure, perform the rituals, keep the gods fed, or the waters will return. But embedded within this warning is something the priests who maintained these tablets across centuries must have recognized, even if the mythology could not explicitly state it. The gods needed the warnings to be heeded not for humanity's sake, but for their own. Because if the cities failed, if the populations collapsed, if the offerings ceased, the gods themselves would be diminished. This is the structural tension that drives the rest of the narrative. The administrators require the workforce. The workforce has become ungovernable. The administrators cannot eliminate the workforce without eliminating themselves. And so the system continues, increasingly precarious, increasingly dependent on ritual maintenance of an order that both parties recognize as fragile. What the tablets describe in the centuries following the flood is not restored divine presence, but increasing divine distance. The gods no longer walk through the streets of Uruk as the hymns describe Inanna doing in earlier periods. They no longer deliver architectural plans in dreams as they did to Gudea. The communication becomes mediated through omens that require specialist interpretation, through signs that grow increasingly ambiguous, through absence that priests try to fill with more elaborate ritual. The system was breaking down, not because humans had failed morally, because the structural contradictions inherent in the system's design were becoming impossible to manage through the theological frameworks that had sustained it. And this breakdown, preserved in administrative language across hundreds of tablets scattered through museum collections, is what modern reinterpretation will eventually transform into a narrative about extraterrestrial departure, planetary orbits, and warnings about cosmic cycles. But we are not there yet. Before we can understand how Bronze Age hydraulic theology became 20th century astronaut mythology, we must first examine what happened when the system finally collapsed. When the gods, according to the tablets themselves, systematically withdrew from the cities they had governed for millennia. The lamentation texts of ancient Mesopotamia form a distinct literary genre, and their preservation across multiple cities suggests they served important ritual functions long after the events they describe. These are not mythological narratives in the style of the Atrahasis epic or the creation accounts. They are something closer to historical documentation filtered through theological interpretation, records of urban collapse framed as divine abandonment. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur is among the most complete examples. The tablet describes the patron deity, Nana, the moon god of Ur, leaving his temple before the city's destruction. The language is specific. He has abandoned his chamber. He has left the city like a bird has left its nest. Nana has abandoned his cherished Ekishnugol, the name of his temple complex. The sequence is critical. The god departs first, then the city falls. The text does not describe Nana fleeing from an invading army. It describes him evacuating in advance of catastrophe, relocating to an unspecified safe location, and only after his departure does the disaster occur. This pattern repeats across multiple lamentation texts. The lamentation over Sumer and Ur expands the scope to include multiple gods abandoning multiple cities in coordinated fashion. Enlil leaving Nippur, Enki leaving Eridu, Inanna leaving Uruk, each deity described using identical phrasing. The god abandoned the temple, departed to an unknown place, carried nothing, was accompanied by other divine refugees. The archaeological evidence aligns with these textual accounts in ways that resist easy dismissal. Excavations at Ur revealed the temple district's innermost sanctuaries had been deliberately sealed, not barricaded against invasion from without, but secured from within, as if preserving rather than defending. There are no signs of forced entry, no evidence of looting in the traditional sense. The sacred chambers were empty not because conquerors had stripped them, but because someone had removed the contents before any threat arrived. Temple inventories from earlier periods catalog extensive holdings: gold and silver cult statues, ceremonial vessels, ritual implements, inscribed tablets recording divine pronouncements. None of these high-value items appear in the archaeological destruction layers. They vanished before the cities fell. At Nippur, the Ekur temple complex, Enlil's primary earthly residence, shows the same pattern. The ziggurat remained structurally intact through the crisis period. But the temple's central chamber, where Enlil's statue should have resided and where offerings should have been presented, was empty when excavators reached it. The surrounding rooms contained offering tables, ceremonial equipment, administrative archives. But the cult statue itself, the physical representation that channeled divine presence, was gone. This is not how military conquest works. Invading armies destroy symbols of enemy gods. They do not carefully remove them for safekeeping. They do not leave temple infrastructure intact while eliminating only the most sacred objects. The textual accounts provide a framework for understanding this archaeological pattern. According to the lamentation texts, the destructions were not random military defeats. They were authorized by the Divine Council, by Enlil, specifically as part of a larger administrative decision. The gods knew catastrophe was coming. They withdrew in advance. They took their sacred objects with them, and they left the cities to whatever forces, military, environmental, or both, would complete the destruction. But the texts also preserve something that complicates the narrative of divine omnipotence. The gods did not want to leave. The lamentation over Ur describes Nana pleading with Enlil to spare his city. He weeps, he argues, he negotiates. Enlil refuses. The destruction, Enlil states, has been decreed at a level beyond Nana's authority to reverse. The decision is binding. The best Nana can do is evacuate before the decree is executed. This raises a question the tablets do not answer directly. If the destruction was authorized by the Divine Council, if it was planned and coordinated, why did it require evacuation? Why would gods who commanded storms and floods need to remove themselves and their sacred objects to safe locations? The texts provide only fragments of explanation. One passage suggests the forces being unleashed were dangerous even to divine entities. Another implies that direct presence in a city undergoing destruction would violate some cosmic principle the gods were bound to observe. A third possibility, never stated explicitly but implied through the overall pattern, is that the gods were not fleeing the disaster itself, but the aftermath. the period of absence, starvation, and administrative collapse that would follow once human populations were eliminated and offerings ceased. What is documented without ambiguity is the aftermath. The cities were destroyed. The temples remained standing but empty. And for centuries following these events, priests continued maintaining the structures, performing rituals to absent gods, making offerings that received no response. This is where the term rigmu reappears, but now describing a different kind of disorder. Not overpopulation, but abandonment. Not excessive human presence, but excessive divine absence. The priests are performing the correct rituals. The offerings are being prepared according to specification. The calendars are being observed, but the gods do not answer. Temple records from the first millennium BCE, nearly 1,000 years after the major destruction events, show priests still consulting oracles about the return of divine presence. Omen texts describe kings trying to determine what offense had driven the gods away and what ritual corrections might persuade them to return. Royal inscriptions record massive temple rebuilding projects undertaken explicitly to lure the deities back to their former residences. But the gods, according to the available evidence, did not return, not in the way the earlier texts described, not with the directness of Ningirsu delivering architectural plans to Gudea in dreams, not with the physical presence that required daily feeding and seasonal clothing changes. What changed was not the human's willingness to worship, but the nature of divine human communication. The gods became distant, transcendent. Their messages came through increasingly ambiguous signs that required specialist interpretation. Lunar eclipses whose significance contradicted previous interpretations. Liver divinations producing conflicting results for the same question. Dreams that multiple priests analyzed differently. The system was degrading. The feedback loop that allowed divine governance to function, clear signs, reliable omens, predictable responses to ritual actions, was breaking down under the strain of divine absence. And into this degradation, a new pattern emerged. Not divine presence, but divine memory. Not active governance, but preservation of the idea of governance. The rituals continued because the framework had been institutionalized so deeply that abandoning it felt more dangerous than maintaining empty forms. The temples were fed because stopping the offerings felt like inviting final catastrophe, even if no evidence suggested the gods were actually consuming them. The final warning in this context is not a message delivered to modern humanity. It is the pattern preserved in these administrative records. When divine presence withdraws, when the gods evacuate their temples, when the offering schedules continue but receive no response, the system enters terminal decline. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inexorably. The civilization continues through institutional momentum, through the weight of tradition, through the priesthood's professional interest in maintaining their own relevance. But the theological foundation has fractured. Later Babylonian prayers reflect this fracture. Early Sumerian hymns address gods as present administrators, Enlil, you who command. Later Babylonian prayers shift to petitions directed at absent authorities. Wherever you are, turn your face toward me. The verb tenses reveal the transformation. Certainty of presence becomes hope for attention. Administration becomes faith. This is what the tablets actually document. Not prophecy about future ages, not warnings about returning planets or cosmic cycles, but the slow collapse of a theological administrative system that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years, preserved in the meticulous bureaucratic language of priests who continued recording offering schedules long after they had any evidence the offerings were being received. The mutation of this historical pattern into modern narrative requires one more element: rediscovery by a culture with entirely different frameworks for understanding divine absence, technological sophistication, and the relationship between knowledge and power. That rediscovery begins in the 19th century, when European archaeologists started digging into the tells of Iraq with assumptions, methods, and psychological needs that would fundamentally reshape how these ancient records were read. In the Weld Blundell Prism, a clay artifact now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, the Sumerian king list begins with a phrase that has troubled translators since its first decipherment. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not established, not developed, descended, lowered, as if kingship were a physical object transferred from one location to another. The list then proceeds to catalogue rulers from before the flood, antediluvian kings whose reigns are measured not in years but in vast temporal spans that strain credibility. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalja of Eridu, 36,000 years. The 8 kings who ruled before the deluge are credited with collective reigns totaling 241,200 years, a chronology that obviously does not function as historical documentation in any conventional sense. Then the list states simply, the flood swept over. And when it resumes, the reign lengths have changed dramatically. Post-Diluvian kings rule for hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands. The numbers gradually decrease across successive dynasties until, by the historical period that can be correlated with archaeological evidence, the reign lengths align with plausible human lifespans. Scholars debate what these enormous numbers represent. Scribal error compounded through multiple copyings. Symbolic designations rather than literal durations. A sexagesimal calculation system that modern readers misinterpret. Or perhaps intentional mythologization designed to project the origins of political order into a timeless past that predates verifiable memory. But regardless of how we interpret the specific numbers, the structure of the list accomplishes something theologically essential. It establishes that kingship itself is not a human invention. It is a divine gift, an administrative tool that descends from the realm of the gods into the earthly realm, where it moves from city to city based on divine decree. This concept that political legitimacy derives from possession of divinely ordained authority rather than from military power or popular consent shapes every subsequent royal inscription in Mesopotamian history. When kings describe their accomplishments, they frame them as service to the gods. When they build temples, they are not constructing monuments to their own glory, but maintaining the physical infrastructure required for divine residence. The foundation deposits excavated from beneath these temples preserve this ideology in material form. Small bronze figurines show the king carrying a basket of mud on his head, the fundamental image of labor, of manual construction work. The inscriptions accompanying these deposits describe the king performing the same tasks the Atrahasis myth attributes to the Agigi before their rebellion, and then to humans after their creation. Digging, carrying, building, maintaining. The implication is clear. By building the temple, the king is performing the labor that keeps cosmic order functioning. He is fulfilling the role humanity was designed for, and in doing so, he maintains the contract that allows civilization to continue. But this contract was not guaranteed. It required constant renewal through ritual action, and it could be broken by the gods if the king failed in his duties, or by the king if he abandoned the rituals that his legitimacy depended upon. The concept of Melam encodes this precariousness. Traditionally translated as terrifying splendor or divine radiance, Melam was understood in Mesopotamian thought as a physical substance. Not a metaphor for charisma or authority, but an actual aura that gods possessed naturally and that they could bestow upon chosen kings. Royal hymns describe kings being clothed in Melam. Temple rituals describe the transfer of Melam from divine statue to human ruler during coronation ceremonies. But Melam could also be withdrawn, lost through impiety, removed by divine decree, and a king without Melam was no longer truly king, regardless of his administrative control or military strength. This is where the omen texts become critical for understanding how the warning functioned within the actual practice of Mesopotamian religion. Because the gods, in this framework, communicated their intentions through observable phenomena. Celestial movements, weather patterns, the configuration of animal organs during sacrificial rituals. The compilation known as Enuma, Anu, Enlil, when Anu and Enlil, preserved across 70 tablets, catalogs thousands of omens derived from astronomical observations. These are not superstitious correlations, but sophisticated pattern tracking based on centuries of empirical data. Mesopotamian astronomers documented lunar eclipses, planetary positions, meteor showers, and comets with precision sufficient that modern scholars use their records to calibrate ancient chronologies. And they correlated these celestial events with earthly outcomes. Not because they believed the planets caused political events through mystical influence, but because both celestial and terrestrial phenomena were understood as manifestations of the same divine administration. Disruption in the heavens signaled disruption in the divine council, and disruption in the divine council preceded disruption on Earth. The logic was administrative, not magical. If Mars approaches the Pleiades, and historically regime change has followed this configuration 7 times out of 10, then when the configuration appears again, the wise administrator prepares for regime change. This is inductive reasoning. Database analysis. The construction of predictive models based on observed correlations. The substitute king ritual demonstrates how seriously Mesopotamian rulers took these predictions. When omens indicated imminent death or political catastrophe for the king, priests would perform an extraordinary procedure. A commoner would be temporarily crowned, dressed in royal garments, given royal privileges, and then, after a calculated interval, executed. The theory was that the ill fate decreed by the divine council would be absorbed by the substitute, while the actual king remained hidden in the temple, preserving institutional continuity. This was not theater. Royal correspondence from the Neo-Assyrian period includes letters between kings and court astrologers discussing the implementation of substitute king protocols. These were administrative decisions based on risk assessment. The omens were understood as divine warnings, advance notice of cosmic decrees that had not yet been executed but were now inevitable unless ritual countermeasures could redirect them. The Marduk prophecy takes this pattern and extends it into a different register. This text, likely composed during or after the period it describes, presents itself as ancient prediction but functions as theological explanation for historical catastrophe. It describes the Gbuti, god Marduk, patron deity of Babylon, leaving his city. Not fleeing, not defeated, simply departing, his cult statue physically removed by invading Hittites, Assyrians, and Elamites. The prophecy describes the apocalyptic conditions that prevailed during Marduk's absence. Brother will eat brother. Friend will strike friend with a mace. Lions will kill. The scepter will grow short. This is not cosmic disaster. This is social collapse. The breakdown of kinship obligations, legal order, protective hierarchy. The civilization descends into what later political philosophers would call a state of nature. Violence, chaos, the war of all against all. But the text frames this collapse not as military defeat or environmental catastrophe, but as the natural consequence of divine absence. When the gods withdraw their protection, when the contract between divine landlords and human workforce is broken, the infrastructure that sustains civilized order simply stops functioning. The warning encoded in these texts is structural. Order is not the default state of reality. It must be maintained through constant labor, through correct ritual performance, through the possession and proper use of the me, those divine ordinances that regulate everything from kingship to agriculture to the proper operation of social hierarchies. Stop maintaining the temples, and the gods leave. When the gods leave, the me are withdrawn. When the me are withdrawn, the mechanisms that allow civilization to function cease operating, and what remains is chaos, not as punishment, but as the natural state that order had temporarily suppressed. This is the final warning that the tablets preserve, not prophecy about events in distant future millennia. but the institutionalized memory of environmental and political catastrophes that had already destroyed multiple Mesopotamian cities, encoded as theological instruction for subsequent generations. The system is fragile, order requires maintenance, and divine presence cannot be assumed. It must be actively sustained through ritual labor that never ends. Within this framework, the gods' withdrawal was not mysterious. It was the predictable outcome of systemic failure. When populations exceeded carrying capacity, when irrigation systems broke down, when the temple offerings could no longer be sustained, the gods, the personified forces of cosmic order, had no choice but to evacuate. They left behind the tablets describing their departure, not as a warning to future technological civilizations, but as an explanation to the survivors of why the cities had fallen and what would be required to prevent the pattern from repeating. But this is not how 20th century readers would interpret these same texts when they were rediscovered, translated, and published to a global audience hungry for explanations of ancient mysteries that mainstream archaeology could not or would not provide. Tablet 20 of Enuma Anu. Enlil contains the following entry. If an eclipse becomes obscured from its center all at once, the king will die. Destruction of Elam. This is not prophecy in the mystical sense. It is a conditional statement derived from historical correlation. At some point in the past, this specific eclipse configuration occurred, and shortly thereafter, Elam, a neighboring kingdom to Sumer, experienced political collapse. The observation was recorded. When the same configuration appeared again and was followed by similar outcomes, the correlation was strengthened. By the time the pattern had repeated enough to be considered reliable, it was codified into the Omen compilation as actionable intelligence. The tablets preserved at the British Museum from Sippar and other Mesopotamian cities contain thousands of these conditional predictions. They are not random associations or poetic imagery. They are databases. Pattern recognition systems developed across centuries of systematic observation, refined through trial and error, maintained by professional specialists whose careers depended on accuracy. The astronomical component of this system was particularly sophisticated. Mesopotamian astronomers tracked lunar cycles with precision sufficient to predict eclipses months in advance. They documented planetary movements, noting retrograde motions, conjunctions, and unusual brightness variations. They recorded meteor showers, comets, and atmospheric phenomena like halos around the moon or discoloration of the sun. But they were not tracking these phenomena out of pure scientific curiosity. They were monitoring the gods' domain for signs of administrative instability. Because if heaven was the realm where the Anunnaki convened their councils and decreed the fates, then irregularities in celestial behavior signaled problems in that decision-making apparatus. The logic, viewed from within their theological framework, was sound. The gods governed both heaven and earth according to stable principles encoded in the me. Disruption in one domain indicated disruption in the other. When celestial mechanics behaved unexpectedly, when Mars stopped and turned back, when Venus did not appear at its calculated time, when a star fell from its place, these were not supernatural events, but observable deviations from expected patterns. And deviations from expected patterns required response. This is where the divination system reveals its fundamentally bureaucratic nature. The priests were not mystics seeking communion with the transcendent. They were administrators monitoring leading indicators of systemic instability. Extispicy, the examination of animal organs, particularly sheep livers, for divinatory purposes, operated on the same principle. The liver was understood as a microcosm of the cosmos. Its lobes, colors, and structural variations were mapped according to complex schemas that assigned meaning to specific configurations. When a king faced a major decision, whether to go to war, whether to appoint a particular official, whether to authorize a construction project, sacrificial animals would be examined following rigorous protocols. The protocols themselves are preserved in instructional texts. Which hand holds which implement, which incision is made first. How to interpret discoloration, enlargement, absence of expected structures. These were reproducible procedures, not improvisational mysticism. And they were taken seriously at the highest levels of government. Royal correspondence from the Neo-Assyrian period includes letters from kings to their court astrologers demanding explanations for contradictory omens. One text describes a military campaign where multiple divination sessions produced conflicting results. One indicated victory, another predicted defeat, a third suggested postponement. The king proceeded anyway, relying on strategic calculation rather than divine guidance. This was new, or rather, it had become common. Earlier texts from the Sumerian and Old Babylonian periods describe kings receiving unambiguous instructions from gods in dreams, following those instructions without strategic debate. By the first millennium BCE, the divine communication channel had degraded significantly. The omens contradicted each other. The signs were ambiguous. The dreams, when they occurred, were unclear enough to require multiple expert interpretations. The prayers from this period reflect the shift. Early Sumerian hymns address gods with administrative confidence. Enlil, you who command the storm, you who decree the fates. Later, Babylonian prayers shift to petitions directed at increasingly distant authorities. Wherever you are, hear me. Turn your face toward me. Accept my offering. The verb tenses are critical. Imperative certainty becomes conditional hope. Present engagement becomes absent potential, but even as the communication degraded, the institutional apparatus continued. Temples maintained offering schedules. Priests performed rituals. Astronomers tracked celestial phenomena. The system persisted through professional momentum, through the weight of tradition, through the priesthood's economic and political investment in maintaining their specialized knowledge. This persistence created a strange historical pattern. 800 years of rituals performed for gods who no longer reliably answered. 800 years of offerings made to absent recipients. 800 years of priests consulting oracles whose responses had become too ambiguous to guide policy with confidence. And yet, the civilization continued. Babylon rebuilt after destructions. Assyria rose to imperial power. The Neo-Babylonian period saw massive construction projects, the codification of astronomical knowledge, advances in mathematics and engineering. None of this required active divine presence. It required only the institutional structures that belief in divine presence had originally generated. The warning in this context is not about the gods' return or cosmic cycles or planetary catastrophes. It is about the fragility of institutional legitimacy once the theological foundation has eroded. The Mesopotamian administrative class continued performing rituals they increasingly suspected received no divine response. They maintained the fiction of divine governance because abandoning it would delegitimize the entire social hierarchy that depended on that fiction. This is what made the system both resilient and brittle. Resilient because it could function for centuries without actual divine input. Brittle because once enough people recognized the fiction as fiction, the legitimacy collapsed entirely. By the Hellenistic period, when Greek and Roman writers encountered Mesopotamian religion, they described it as ancient tradition rather than living faith. The Babyloniaca of Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 BCE, preserves fragments of the Anunnaki mythology, but as cultural memory rather than operational theology. The gods had become historical figures. Their messages had become ancient texts requiring scholarly interpretation rather than immediate divine communication. The transformation was complete. What had been a bureaucratic theology, gods as active administrators requiring daily bread and issuing binding decrees, had become mythology, symbolism, cultural heritage. But the tablets remained. The offering lists, the omen compilations, the flood narratives, the lamentation texts, all preserved in clay, scattered across museum collections. waiting for modern interpreters who would bring entirely new assumptions to the task of reading them. Those interpreters would not see bureaucratic theology describing hydraulic engineering crises. They would see technological descriptions misunderstood by primitive witnesses. They would see evidence of extraterrestrial contact filtered through Bronze Age ignorance. They would see warnings about planetary catastrophism encoded in symbolic language. And they would build from these ancient administrative records a modern mythology more durable, more globally distributed, and more resistant to scholarly correction than the original texts had ever been. In 1976, a Russian-born electrical engineer, an amateur sumerologist named Zecharia Sitchin, published The 12th Planet, the first volume in what would become a 7-book series called The Earth Chronicles. The central thesis was straightforward. The Anunnaki were not mythological deities, but extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold needed for atmospheric repair on their home world. When the mining operation proved too labor-intensive, they genetically engineered modern humans as a worker species, combining their own DNA with that of primitive hominids. The genetic engineering took place in what the Sumerians called the Abzu, which Sitchin translated as a laboratory facility in southeastern Africa. After millennia of direct governance, the Anunnaki departed, but not before establishing kingship and civilization to ensure humanity's continued development. The books sold millions of copies. They spawned an entire subgenre of ancient astronaut literature. They influenced television series, documentary films, and countless internet articles. Today, if you search for Anunnaki, the dominant results reflect Sitchin's interpretation far more than scholarly Assyriology. But every key translation that Sitchin's thesis depends upon is incorrect according to Sumerian and Akkadian linguistic scholarship. The most fundamental error involves the term Mu, which Sitchin translates as rocket ship or sky vehicle. The Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, the authoritative scholarly resource compiled through decades of collaborative work by Sumerologists worldwide, defines Mu as name, line of text, or year. It is one of the most common words in Sumerian administrative texts. It appears in phrases like Mubai, meaning its name, or in dating formulas where each year is named after a significant event. When Sumerian texts describe a king wanting to make a mu for himself, Sitchin reads this as constructing a rocket or sky vehicle. The actual idiom means to make a name for oneself, to establish reputation, to build monuments that will preserve one's identity for future generations. This is a standard ancient Near Eastern concept appearing in the Hebrew Bible's Tower of Babel narrative, where the builders explicitly state their goal. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name, Shem, for ourselves. Sitchin connects this Hebrew Shem to Mu, claiming both refer to spacecraft. But Shem in biblical Hebrew means name or monument, not vehicle. The tower is not a launch platform. It is a ziggurat, a stepped pyramid temple of the exact type that dominated Mesopotamian cityscapes and whose ruins still exist in Iraq. The gold mining interpretation of the Atrahasis myth involves similar mistranslation. Sitchin claims the epic describes the Igigi mining gold in deep shafts in southeastern Africa. The actual text describes them digging patis, irrigation canals. The word for gold in Sumerian is guskin, in Akkadian, hurasu. Neither term appears in the creation or labor rebellion sections of Atrahasis. What appears instead are terms for canal, channel, river mouth, silt, the technical vocabulary of hydraulic engineering. The text explicitly states the purpose of the labor, to maintain the agricultural infrastructure of Mesopotamia. There is no mention of gold, no mention of mining, no mention of Africa. These elements enter the narrative through Sitchin's interpretive framework, not through the tablets themselves. The 12th planet interpretation rests on Sitchin's analysis of cylinder seal Fiver 243, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. The seal shows a 6-pointed star surrounded by several smaller circles, which Sitchin identified as the Sun surrounded by 11 planets, the known 9, plus the Moon, counted as a planet, plus Nibiru as the 12th body. Assyriologists examining the same seal point out several problems with this interpretation. First, the Mesopotamian symbol for the sun god Shamash is a 4-pointed star with wavy rays, not a 6-pointed star. The central symbol on Va, a 243, is a generic deity marker, or possibly represents the goddess Inanna/Ishtar, whose symbol was typically an 8-pointed star, but whose representations varied. Second, the circles around the star are not to scale in a way that would represent planetary orbits. They appear to be decorative elements, or possibly other deities, which is standard for Mesopotamian seal iconography. Third, the Sumerians did not organize celestial bodies into a 12-planet system. Their astronomical texts recognize 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, plus the Sun and Moon as the 7 major celestial powers. The term Nibiru does appear in Mesopotamian astronomical texts, but scholarly consensus identifies it as Jupiter, or possibly as an asterism marking the spring equinox crossing point. The word translates as ferry or crossing, something that transits through the sky. There is no textual evidence for Nibiru as a planet on a 3,600-year elliptical orbit, bringing it periodically into the inner solar system. Astronomers examining Sitchin's orbital mechanics note that such an orbit would be unstable over geological timescales. Gravitational interactions with the outer planets would either eject the hypothetical planet from the solar system or pull it into a collision course with an inner planet within a few million years. Additionally, a planet-sized body passing through the inner solar system every 3,600 years would produce observable gravitational effects on known planetary orbits. No such perturbations have been detected. Michael Heiser, a scholar with a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages, conducted extensive analysis of Sitchin's translations and published the results in academic papers and a book titled The Unseen Realm. Heiser demonstrates that Sitchin's work is not simply alternative interpretation of ambiguous evidence, but systematic mistranslation of unambiguous terms. The errors are not scattered mistakes, but pattern-consistent misreadings that always support the ancient astronaut thesis. Yet the thesis persists. It circulates through internet forums, YouTube documentaries, podcast series. It is believed by millions of people despite being rejected by every major research institution, every Sumerology department, every professional Assyriologist. Why? Part of the answer is cognitive. Pattern recognition is a fundamental human capacity, essential for survival but vulnerable to false positives. Modern readers see conical shapes and flames in ancient art, and immediately associate them with rockets, because rockets are the conical flaming objects their culture is familiar with. The fact that the conical shape in Sumerian iconography is a horned tiara, the standard visual marker of divinity across thousands of years of Mesopotamian art, gets filtered out. The flames are divine radiance, the malamu, visually represented as emanating rays. But once the rocket association is made, every subsequent ambiguous image gets interpreted through that lens. There is also technological projection. Modern civilization has achieved spaceflight. Our most sophisticated engineering involves rockets, satellites, planetary exploration. When we encounter ancient accounts of beings descending from the sky or ascending to heaven, we unconsciously translate those concepts into our own technological vocabulary. The alternative, that ancient peoples used sky and heaven as theological or cosmological concepts without technological content, feels less satisfying because it requires accepting that sophisticated civilizations could develop without following our own technological trajectory. Cultural dissatisfaction plays a role as well. The claim that ancient peoples could not have built the pyramids or developed complex mathematics without extraterrestrial help is a form of chronological snobbery. It assumes that humans 5,000 years ago were less intelligent, less capable, less innovative than modern humans. This assumption is historically baseless. Human cognitive capacity has not meaningfully changed in the past 100,000 years, but it persists because it makes our own era feel uniquely advanced. There is also institutional distrust. The narrative that mainstream archaeologists and historians are suppressing evidence of ancient contact because it would destabilize their professional authority has psychological appeal. It transforms the believer into a truth seeker resisting an establishment conspiracy, which is emotionally satisfying in ways that accepting conventional scholarly consensus is not. And finally, there is the nature of fragmentary evidence itself. The tablets are broken. Key passages are missing. Translation always involves interpretive choices. This creates genuine ambiguity, and ambiguity creates space for alternative readings. When Sitchin filled that space with rockets and genetic engineering, he was exploiting real gaps in the record. The problem is not that he interpreted ambiguous passages. Interpretation is necessary when dealing with fragmentary ancient texts. The problem is that he mistranslated unambiguous passages to create ambiguity where none existed. The result is a modern mythology built on systematic linguistic error, and like all successful mythologies, it tells people something they want to hear, that humanity is not alone in the cosmos, that our origins are more extraordinary than conventional science admits, that hidden knowledge exists which mainstream institutions deliberately obscure. The tablets, meanwhile, continue to tell a different story, not about rockets, but about canals. Not about gold mining, but about irrigation engineering. Not about genetic laboratories, but about theological economic relationships between gods who required feeding and humans who required governance. But this story, the one the tablets actually preserve, has become harder to hear beneath the accumulated noise of modern reinterpretation. In 2024, the Electronic Babylonian Library at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich announced a breakthrough in digital epigraphy. Using artificial intelligence trained on three-dimensional scans of cuneiform tablets, their algorithms successfully matched fragments that had been stored in different museums on different continents for over a century. One of these newly reconstructed texts, designated NI 12501 from Nippur, preserves a previously unknown hymn describing the storm god Ishkur being rescued from the netherworld by a fox. The narrative is fragmentary, the motivations unclear, the theological implications still being analyzed, but the discovery demonstrates something essential about the state of our knowledge regarding the Anunnaki and the records they left behind. We are still finding the message. The majority of the 500,000 tablets excavated from Mesopotamian sites remain untranslated. Hundreds of thousands of fragments sit in museum storage, catalogued but unread, waiting for scholars with the time and expertise to process them. And now, algorithms are reading them faster than humans ever could. Computer vision systems can recognize cuneiform signs. Natural language processing can identify linguistic patterns across enormous textual databases. Machine learning can suggest fragment joins that would take human researchers lifetimes to discover manually. What this means is that the Sumerian records have not finished revealing themselves. Each new translation changes the context of existing knowledge. Each fragment join modifies our understanding of narrative patterns. The final warning may not yet be complete because we have not yet recovered all the clay that contains it. But what we have recovered, what the tablets consistently describe across multiple cities, multiple time periods, multiple literary genres, is a pattern of systemic fragility. Not prophecy about cosmic catastrophe, not warnings encoded for technological civilizations millennia in the future, but the institutionalized memory of environmental and administrative collapse, preserved in theological language because theology was the framework through which Bronze Age societies understood causation. The gods were not extraterrestrials. They were the personified forces that maintained order, reliable flooding, successful harvests, functioning irrigation systems, stable political hierarchies. When those systems failed, when the rivers changed course, when salinization destroyed agricultural land, when populations exceeded infrastructure capacity, when political legitimacy fractured, the gods were described as withdrawing. Not because supernatural beings literally departed, but because the cosmic order those beings represented had ceased functioning. The warning encoded in kingship was that maintaining order requires constant ritual and physical labor. The warning encoded in the flood narratives was that populations cannot exceed environmental carrying capacity without catastrophic correction. The warning encoded in divine withdrawal was that when the social contract between rulers and ruled breaks down, neither party survives the collapse. These are not mystical insights. They are observations about political ecology, resource management, and institutional resilience. They were encoded in theological language because theology was the discourse through which ancient Mesopotamians theorized about power, causation, and the forces that sustained or destroyed civilizations. Modern reinterpretation has transformed these practical observations into cosmic drama. The hydraulic crisis becomes a genetic engineering project. The administrative hierarchy becomes an extraterrestrial colonial structure. The flood becomes planetary catastrophism. The divine withdrawal becomes a literal physical departure to a home world in the outer solar system. This transformation is not simply error. It is mythogenesis, the generation of new mythology using old materials. And it demonstrates something the original Sumerian scribes would have recognized. Humans require narrative frameworks to make sense of existence. When the gods stopped answering, the Mesopotamians did not abandon theology. They adapted it, made it more transcendent, more symbolic, more capable of functioning without direct divine input. When 20th century readers encountered these ancient texts through the lens of space-age technology, they did not abandon the ancient astronaut interpretation when scholars demonstrated the translations were incorrect. They adapted it, made it more elaborate, more resistant to debunking, more capable of incorporating contradictory evidence into an expanding conspiracy framework. The tablets themselves remain what they have always been: clay impressions of wedge-shaped marks, baked hard by time and fire, preserved through accident and intention, waiting in climate-controlled archives. They can be read, they can be translated, they can be analyzed linguistically, archaeologically, historically. And when that analysis is performed with rigor, they describe Bronze Age urban civilization struggling with resource scarcity, political instability, environmental catastrophe, and the eventual collapse of the theological frameworks that had sustained administrative legitimacy. They describe gods who needed humans as much as humans needed gods, who went hungry when offerings stopped, who cowered during the flood they had authorized, who withdrew not in triumph but in crisis, leaving behind tablets explaining the departure in administrative language that assumed future readers would understand the bureaucratic logic involved. The real final warning is not about returning planets or cosmic cycles. It is about fragility, about the constant labor required to maintain order against entropy, about the consequences when populations exceed the capacity of their infrastructure, about what happens when the institutional frameworks that sustain civilization lose the legitimacy that allows them to function. These warnings remain relevant not because Bronze Age priests possessed prophetic knowledge of modern conditions, but because the fundamental constraints they dealt with, environmental limits, resource distribution, institutional legitimacy, the balance between population and carrying capacity, are constraints every civilization faces regardless of technological sophistication. The tablets will continue to emerge from museum basements. Algorithms will continue finding new joins. Translations will continue to be refined. Our understanding of what the Anunnaki were, what functions they served, what their warnings actually communicated, will continue to evolve as new evidence surfaces and interpretive frameworks adapt. But the clay itself will not change. The marks pressed into its surface 5,000 years ago remain fixed. What changes is our capacity to read them accurately, to separate what the scribes actually wrote from what we wish they had written, to distinguish ancient meaning from modern projection. The investigation remains open, the archive incomplete, the story unresolved. And perhaps that is the most important insight the tablets offer. Certainty is an illusion. Knowledge is fragmentary. Interpretation requires humility. And the warnings preserved in ancient clay speak not to the future, but to the recurring patterns that every human civilization must navigate, or fail to navigate, regardless of whether they frame those patterns in theological language, scientific terminology, or the speculative mythology of ancient astronauts descending from the stars. The Anunnaki left records. That much is certain. What those records actually say continues to be discovered. What they mean continues to be debated. And why that meaning matters, what it reveals about the civilizations that created them and the civilizations that rediscover them, remains the deepest mystery of all.